Should we give 1 more minute for people to join?
Yep.
Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are across the world. Thank you for joining this IAA webinar on actuarial support for the implementation of IFRS 17. The duration of this webinar will be 60 minutes, including some time for questions and answers at the end. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand side of your screen to submit your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for access from the IA website tomorrow. I will now hand over to Greg Martin, who will be moderating this session.
Thank you very much, Amali. Welcome everybody to our International Actuarial Association, or IAA, webinar on ISAP 4 to do with actuarial support for IFRS 17. ISAP 4 was developed by the Actuarial Standards Committee of the IAA by a lot of hard work by ISAP 4 Task Force over quite a few years. We should be we have two very distinguished members of that task force here today to present to us, and who've been working right at the coalface of the development of ISAP 4. So Micheline Dion, who was the chair of the task force, who will be presenting, I'll hand over to present in a moment, and Luke Farmer, who's a vice chair of the task force, but also is on the ASC and was the ASC liaison member for the task force. I think I'd like to just start by just thanking the task force and acknowledge the very hard work that they've put in. Before I hand over, just one other thing. I should note the purpose of ISAPs, so we make sure we're clear. The objective of ISAPs is to be, from the IA strategy, widely accepted as the basis of convergence by local standard setters and recognised by parties who rely on actuarial standards such as audit firms, the IASB, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, IOSCO, and indeed local regulators who might look to such things. Importantly, ISAPs, including ISAP 4, they are model standards. They don't themselves apply to individual actuaries. Only actuarial associations who set standards have that sort of authority. They are, however, meant to be a good quality, high quality model that local standard setters, actuarial associations, etc., can adopt or implement as they see fit, and as I said, help with global convergence and the global standing of actuaries. That's my few words of introduction. I'd now like to hand over to Micheline to lead us through the presentation. And as Amali said a minute ago, any questions, please put them in there and I'll sort of moderate towards the end of the session. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Greg, and welcome everyone. Before we start, I would like to give you an overview of what we will be covering in my part of the presentation. First thing about what we are not covering, it's definitively not going to be a detailed presentation on IFRS 17. The IASB has a number of presentations on their website explaining different features of IFRS 17, and they have presentation geared at different level of understanding of IFRS 17. So I will point this website to you as providing this information if you need so. It's also not going to be a presentation on the specific guidance of ISAP 4. The ISAP 4 is a brief document. It's only 9 pages long, so it's rather easy to go through. But I guess what we want to do here is give you the background, the insight behind it, so that it makes it much easier for you to read it, knowing what was our intent when we built it. So the presentation will focus on the background behind ISAP 4, look at why ISAP 4 was developed, what it covers in general terms, what it does not cover, how it should be read, especially in relationship with IFRS 17 and ISAP 1, which process the task force went through with the Actuarial Standards Committee to ensure that it was solid and helpful so that the Actuarial Association could rely on it. Then we will look at the ISAP 4 current status, considering that the ISB is making amendments to IFRS 17. And I will provide you information about the other tools available to help actuaries, tools that have been built by the IAA. I guess first slide. So why support IFRS 17? So before we talked about ISAP 4, I'd like to have a few words on IFRS 17. So over a period of 20 years or so, the IAA has been commenting on the various drafts version of IFRS 17, originally called IFRS 4, through its Insurance Accounting Committee. The Insurance Accounting Committee also responded to questions from the IASB regarding product, risk assessment, and valuation practices. Prior to IFRS 17, there was a wide divergence of approach to insurance contract accounting amongst jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions used assumption fixed from pricing. Some measures were incomplete, not measuring the cost of guarantees and options, for example, and most lacked sufficient disclosure. Hence, it was hard to understand measurement across jurisdictions, and sometimes even within a jurisdiction. Arbitrage between jurisdictions was common. This represented an opportunity for some, but was not ideal from a public interest perspective. What does IFRS 17 brings? It brings a set of common accounting principles. It provides greater comparability between jurisdictions while leaving room for judgment and some optionality to facilitate the difficult task of landing into a common basis. It comes with extensive disclosure to provide more insights into a complex measurement. The measurement of insurance contract is indeed complex, but with more disclosure, it will likely be easier to identify the sources of profit and losses and the impact of changes in estimates. Next slide. So why build ISAP 4 to support IFRS 17? What does ISAP 4 brings as complementary guidance to IFRS 17? IFRS 17 is accounting guidance. It covers many topics, but not necessarily from an actual perspective. Since 2013, the IAA has been working in parallel to develop an accompanying guidance to actuaries. The focus of ISAP 4 is to address the actuarial aspect of the measurement of insurance contract in accordance with IFRS 17. In line with IFRS 17, ISAP 4 is principle-based. This is important to be able to cover a wide variety of insurance products, including products not yet on the market. ISAP 4 is not country-specific. So if a jurisdiction wants to address a specific concern, it would have to be done at the jurisdiction level, not at the ISAP 4 level, as ISAP 4 is international in nature. ISAP 4 complements IFRS 17 without repeating it. Repeating creates a risk that different interpretation could be triggered by the ISAP, which is clearly not the intent. And And to help the complementarity, the same vocabulary has been used in both. Also complements ISAP 1. ISAP 1 was developed as a general standard applying to all actuarial practice. ISAP 1 is a prerequisite for ISAP 4. We will discuss the content of ISAP 1 later in this presentation. Of ISAPs, ISAP 4 and ISAP 1, just Greg mentioned, is to facilitate convergence in standard of actual practice. Topics addressed in ISAP 4 are future cash flows. The IFRS talks about future cash flows using all available information, all guarantees and options. ISAP 4 complements it by covering the analysis of similar risks together and clarifying that pricing may not be relevant for the purpose of IFRS 17. It asks the actuary to take into account the dynamics of assumption. They relate to one another and interact. It looks at expectations under a full range of distribution to catch catastrophes or provide for the impact and it also looks at long-term trends. ISAP, the treatment of the future management action. When as option provided in the contract, the actuary will look at the contract, but at how management will exercise its right from a realistic perspective. Some actions, policyholder contract, and policy illustration create policyholder expectations. All of them will be taken into account throughout how management will exercise its options. Adjustment, which has adjustments are looked at from the entity's view of risk. Often the actuary would have been involved in the determination of risk, but the risk appetite may need to be translated into the IFRS 17 framework and properly allocated. Another sensitive point covered by ISAP 4 is discount rates. Discount rates are difficult to determine. First, because it includes an illiquid assessment that is linked to the characteristics of the liabilities, and both the illiquidity premium and the estimation of the liquidity of the insurance contract are difficult to assess. Second, the insurance contract can extend well beyond the observable period, which by definition is also very difficult to assess. So now, yes, thank you very much for passing the slide. Yes, so what are the topic covered in ISAP 4? ISAP 4 covers the full sequence of the measurement process. It first starts with the specific knowledge requirement. Knowledge of IFRS 17 and all other applicable accounting standards, including IFRS 13 on fair value. Knowledge of the business environment of the entity, of the product, its operation, of the internal risk appetite, and the impact of a legal environment, just to name a few things that will impact the business. As before we do look at measuring the contract, we need to identify and group them. That could be done by non-actuaries, maybe accountants. If that is the case, the actuary will have to be clear if he takes responsibility for how it was done, use the work of somebody else. A similar process is used for the choice of measurement approach, like the general measurement approach, the premium allocation approach, or the variable fee approach. Here again, the actuary will have to be clear if he takes responsibility for the work of others, if that is the case, and if not, the work of somebody else. Section of ISAP 4 is about the selection of assumptions for the future cash flow or the risk adjustment. There is general guidance provided and guidance provided for each separate types of assumption, as each of them need to take into account present circumstances. Eventually, assumptions will need to be updated. If this happens, the actuary will have to report on the rationale update and discuss with the principal as to whether it represents a change in accounting policy, a change in accounting estimate. ISAP 4 covers also challenges related to the transition and the measurement of transition. Have to made there, and so the challenges are whether there is availability and integrity of data to reconstruct the past. The availability of information on products not anymore is also challenging. Could be challenging. The availability to project from a past date future management actions or risk adjustments without the benefit of insights. And the last step, actually, will have to provide information to allow proper disclosure and will have to communicate clearly about it. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that we talked about ISAP 1 because of ISAP 1 and ISAP 4 do go hand in hand. ISAP 1 is, as I said, a prerequisite for ISAP 4. If you adopt ISAP 4 in your jurisdiction, you need to consider adopting ISAP 1 or its equivalent for ISAP 4 to make sense. Topics covered by ISAP 1 are the following type: acceptance of assignments with the guidance about things like the avoidance of conflict of interest, the access to proper information and having the proper knowledge to do a good job, proper assessment of materiality from an intended user point of view, proper validation of data and assessment of data deficiencies, proper reliance on others and disclosure of that reliance when needed, proper documentation and communication of the approaches used and the result with the proper caveat when needed. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the process that, as a task force, we went through with the Actuarial Association, the Actuarial Standards Committee, and all the process to provide the end product. So the process followed was needed to ensure that ISAP 4 is supportive of the need of the actuaries, that it is clear and concise, that it is principle-based, and that it covers all the needs to be covered. The process started with a statement of intent describing the elements to be covered, with the statement of intent published in 2013, and for which comments were received from the Actuarial Association, members of the IAA, as well as a number of interested parties. Progress on the actuarial standard was monitored twice a year by the Actuarial Standards Committee of the IAA, with advice given to the task force on points for improvement. Changes were also made to recognize changes to IFRS 17 as it evolved to its final status in May 2017. A first exposure to the member association and interested parties was made in February 2018, only 10 months after the release of the final IFRS 17 in May 2017. We received over 200 comments from 21 organizations. Task Force documented all comments received and how we were addressing it with the rationale for doing so. In February 2019, we re-exposed ISAP 4 with the response report. On the second exposure, comment had reduced to 25% of what it was in the first round. The response report proved to be a very useful means of communication. Finally, we issued a fatal review document in July 2019 that confirmed that indeed we had buy-in and that we were ready to move to approval. Next slide. ISAP 4 has been adopted by the IA Council, which includes over 70 actuarial associations, on November 21st, 2019 in Tokyo. The vote for adoption was unanimous, which is the best recognition that the task force could expect. It's a recognition of the amount of work done, the degree in which you can rely on its quality. The task force has not yet been dismissed, as the IASB has reopened a number of topics and is currently looking at amendments. Such amendments are expected by mid-year 2020. At that point, the task force will review its work and will make the required changes. Because the amendments are technical in nature, rather than changing the principles behind them, the task force does not expect to make any change, but will nevertheless do the full review to make really sure. Next slide. I would like to thank all the individuals that have been members of the ISAP 4 task force. Most of them have been with the task force since 2013. Over the years, we had a few additions and departures. Overall, the members come from all 5 continents, have had experience with large, medium, small organizations, and have worked in general insurance, life insurance, reinsurance, consulting firms. Overall, a very good array of very diversified experience, which was a great support to help us achieve our goals. My sincere thanks to all who gave their time over such a long period. Thanks also to all the individuals and associations that provided the comments we needed to get the job done. And thanks to the ASC for having been so supportive over the years. Next slide. Just a second, let me see that. Yes, sorry. I cannot leave you without mentioning the related material that has been developed over the years by the IAA and related to IFRS 17. But we have 2 monographs, one on discount rate and one on the risk adjustment. The one on discount rate is an all-inclusive educational reference that is very relevant to IFRS 17, but that was developed somewhat before we knew about what the IFRS 17 will look like totally. While the risk adjustment is a monograph that was specifically focused on IFRS 17. So the one on the discount rate dates from October 2013 and risk adjustment 2018. We also have the International Actuarial Note. It has been exposed in July 2019. It received many comments, which is not surprising considering that it is over 200 pages. We expect that it will be issued or re-exposed in the coming months. Please stay tuned for its final release. It will also need to be reviewed to cover the IFRS 17 amendments. In the case of the IAN, the IFRS 17 amendment will definitively generate a number of changes to the IAN. Neither the monograph on discount rates and risk adjustment nor the IAN provides authoritative guidance, but they will be nevertheless helpful for the actuaries by providing examples of the insurance contract examples of how the insurance contract can be measured under IFRS 17, even if some examples would not apply in the circumstances that the actuary is investigating. Thank you very, very much for your attention. And let me pass the mic to Luc Farmer, Vice Chair of the Actuarial Standard Committee of the IAA and liaison to the ISAP 4 Task Force.
Thank you, Micheline. Welcome, everybody. Please go to the next slide. So now that Micheline has given you the details behind ISAP 4 model standard, I will use this slide to do a little bit of marketing. And so I will outline the reasons why local standard setters should adopt this model standard. So there are many reasons to adopt it. Among them, well, as Micheline said, it is a model standard that has had international exposure in many ways. So the task force members represented a broad of everybody around the world and around practices. It is also true for the ASC members who had, as a committee, a final say on this prior to council. And all FMAs had more than one opportunity because there was 2 exposure drafts. So 2 opportunities to comment on the standards since there was 2 exposure drafts. So that's one reason. And another one is, of course, it's to increase the confidence in local actuaries to use an international standard, especially true for the smaller associations. And it will help optimize local standard setting resources. But at the same time, you need to focus, so the local standard setting should focus on have a very strong process to have the buy-in of the local members as well as transparency. So what is the local adoption process? It should be very similar to the one used by the IAA. So there will be an exposure period amongst the stakeholders to get their feedback and to have the opportunity for the stakeholders to comment. Second, the local standard setter will analyze all comments and act on them the same way as it has been done at the IAA for the ISAP 4 model standard. And that phase should be repeated as is necessary. Finally, we need to adjust the model standard for any local particularities. Some of them could be legal environment in a certain country, products that are particular to your locality, or regulations. And Micheline mentioned it. You cannot adopt ISAP 4 without having ISAP 1, which is the general standard. So they go, as she said, hand to hand. And so if an association has not adopted ISAP 1, it is imperative to adopt it before they adopt ISAP 4. I now give the floor to Greg, who's going to monitor questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Micheline and Luc. At this stage, we're just waiting for some questions to come through, but while we do, maybe I could start with a question. And I'm not sure, Micheline, maybe it's for you. On EN 100, you talked about coming months and what happens when ISAP 17 changes. Are you able to make any further comments on timing as to if the IA is likely to release another exposure draft before IFRS 7 is changed, or a little bit more about what might happen?
Okay. There has been so the IAN has been exposed, received comments, like tons of comments, that probably 1,000 comments, and considering again that it's 200 pages and more, so that's it's not surprising. So people have been working on this very diligently. They are now starting to see that the process will end. That is that they will have considered all the comments. They are likely to come out before the review of IFRS 17 amendments, which is mid 2020, so in 4 months. So when exactly will be out? I mean, there is the probably optimistic date, which is the end of February, probably more likely a bit after that, and hopefully before the Brussels meeting. But I mean, again, with all the fact that this is so huge, I mean, it's always very difficult to predict. I also know that the professionalism committee, which is the one, so when we worked as a task force on ISAP 4, you were the one at the Actuarial Standards Committee to give us the green light. In the case of the IAN, the one that gives the green light is the professionalism committee. And they've started reviewing the final version of a number of chapters. So they've already gone into that process. And as more and more chapters are finalized, they're going to do that so that to expedite the process as much as possible. So hopefully that gives you some sense of the timing that we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Micheline. So I've actually lost my little question bar on my webinar, so I can't see if there's any questions. Amali, have we got questions coming through?
I don't see any, Greg.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know what's happened. It's just disappeared off my computer and I can't get it back. So if you guys can see questions. Okay. You also touched on, Micheline, around the question of changes to IFRS 17 and, obviously review those. And again, if there was anything that required, that went to principles or whatever, if there was anything that impacted IFRS 4, any thoughts, Micheline or Luke, on potential timing of when that might be reviewed and the next version come out at all? Any thoughts at all?
Well, I guess what they're talking about finalizing their amendments by the end of Q2, so end of June 2020. So we need to see them before we do anything. Typically, we've been quite good at reviewing things diligently, because people are indeed looking for final documents to be able to do their work. So I would expect that we would be back sometime in the second half of 2020, and ideally before say the September October mark. And I'm saying this because I am thinking that, I mean, if there is some principles that are being changed, I'm not it will be the odd one. Not all the amendments are going to touch, I'm pretty sure, on principle. So it will maybe one or two, so that would make our job quite easier from an ISAP 4 perspective. On the IAN, though, I mean, they will have to do the full job on all the amendments.
One thing for sure is that the the changes or no changes decision on ISAP 4 should be much faster than on the EIN, as Micheline just said, because probably very few, if any, will have an impact on ISAP 4, so it should be quite fast. But on the IAN, that's a different story, and so it should take a longer. It will be a longer process.
Thank you, Luke. Are there any questions we have coming through?
Nope.
Okay. Is there anything from the session a few hours ago, Micheline or Luke, that you thought you might like to just add before? Because if there are no questions, otherwise we'll wrap up the webinar. So, anything else?
There was one question regarding whether the IAA would provide possible interpretations, and so that was, I guess, the reference we got from Andrew this morning is that the ASC was going to discuss what type of involvement it could have on this regard. So maybe I don't know if you want to discuss a bit about that. Certainly, in terms of discussion, there's lots of discussion on the Insurance Accounting Committee for people to exchange how things are done. Yeah,
I will go a little bit on that. So at the ASC, up to last year, there was a decision and a written document saying that the ASC does the ISAPs and promulgate them, but they do not give interpretation. In the last year, we've had one request from one member association, which has made us think more. So at the ASC, we are right now in the process of reviewing this and seeing if in the future where there would be an interpretation request, if we're going to answer or not. But this is a work in progress. As our current process is not to give interpretation, but that is probably changing.
There's also, sorry.
I was going to say, Luke, I was just going to agree. I think the only two caveats I potentially put on that is if we were giving interpretations, it would be fairly narrow and would be directly to, fairly significant, bodies like a member association or something, which would come up there. ASC is, I think, won't be out providing, guidance on how to interpret our ISAPs generally, or just responding to individual questions. It's more likely that if we have to start interpreting things, we'd have to start thinking about whether we needed to fix a standard generally. I think we will stay pretty much in a theory that we don't generally offer interpretations, but as you said, there can be some exceptions, and we're just looking at that. Yep. Sorry, Micheline.
Yeah, the other topics that was kind of linked to this was help to association. And then here I'd like Emily to show the next slide, where we basically, and that type of help is probably more likely where people wondering how to work, so to adopt ISAP 4 and what's the process, and be guided into what it requires. So definitively there, I think there is a will to assist. And I guess you have Amelie being the contact person with her email address and phone number for those interested. And depending on if you have a slightly different request, then Amelie could also forward it to the proper body within the IAA, whether it's the Actuarial Standards Committee, the Insurance Accounting Committee, or the Professionalism Committee.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. If there are no other questions at this stage, would just fall to me then to say, sorry?
I think there is one question that just popped out. Which I can read. It says, and then and interpretations need to be for actuaries, not accountants. Okay, so it's when we were saying that if we give interpretation, I think somebody just said, and those interpretation needs to be for actuaries, not accountants. Probably for now we are not giving interpretations, and we will clearly define if we do open the door slightly.
Yeah, so just to be absolutely clear, when we talked about interpretation, it would be only interpretation of ISAP 4. Yeah. We would not be giving any interpretations whatsoever about IFRS 17 or anything to do with fundamental accounting issues. Correct, Luke? So when we were talking about interpretation, it was only if member associations or other ask the ASC in ISAP 4, you say this, what exactly did you mean by that? Or does that mean A or B? Yeah, there'd be no, and that's correct. Yeah, Mr. Rush, that would be related to that.
So Greg, that was the only question on the board.
Yeah, that's sort of popped up now. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you for everybody who's attended. I hope you got some value out of the webinar. And thank you very, very much, Michelin and Luke, for presentation. And I wish you all a good rest of the morning, afternoon, or evening. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.